We did a Noir at the Bar. It was like a bar slash pizza joint where we did like a book reading out in Baltimore. Read some stories, drank some. I was on whiskey that night, I think. I don't remember, but it's a fair bet. And you kept it going. You were doing like the world tour, Noir world tour.
Yeah, me and another writer named Eric Pruitt, we did a East Coast Noir at the Bar tour. So we started in Durham and did Noirs at the Bar in Durham, Richmond, DC, Baltimore, Delaware, and then we came back to Baltimore and did a lecture. And in between, there's a lot of not safe for work stuff that happened. We still can't talk about. So
if you caught him in the lobby last night when you got in, you would have gotten the gritty stories.
But no, it's been it's fun. I love doing events with other writers and stuff as well. My poor wife, I bug her all the time, and she's just so tired of it. She's so tired. Like, it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm writing something, and I'm like, hey, read this. Somebody got hit in the head with a hammer. But other than that, I just want to sleep. Please, God, let me sleep. So it's nice to be around other writers.
Well, my wife appreciates it. Like, go make some friends. Stop talking to me. So we're gonna read some selections for you guys, and then we can do like a Q&A or whatever you guys want to do at the end. I find those to be a little more engaging and fun than, I read generally to my children, so you guys this is weird. So, when you're an adult. Except for that guy. You kind of look like my daughter. Madison, is that you?
Oh, man, your daughter's in the circus.
So pretty generic, actually. I can say it like that. But it's also got a lot of dark shit in it. So I'm going to read it. I got one part in here that I think as a standalone section, it's kind of cool. And I'm going to go with it. This is the uncorrected arc, so if I hit a typo or fumble a word, somebody make a note so I can go back and fix it. All right. No more than 40 minutes later, he drove past a rustic roadside tavern with a smattering of cars in the graveled parking lot. When traveling, he preferred to stick to the secondary roads, which was why he was on this unencumbered ribbon of asphalt this evening instead of the interstate. Had he taken the interstate, he never would have seen the woman in the luminescent white halter top standing in the gravel lot on her cell phone and smoking a cigarette. Stull, who never went even a single mile over the speed limit, slowed to 5 below it as his pre-owned Kia Rio rolled past the tavern. The place was called Shirley's, as evidenced by the neon pink sign on the roof. Shirley was a good, solid, reliable name. Stull's mother's name had been Shirley. He drove about a quarter of a mile down the road before executing a casual U-turn. He rarely did maneuvers like this in his car. He was a rule follower by nature, and he shuddered at the idea of a police officer pulling him over, berating him, handing him a ticket. But he hadn't seen another vehicle on this stretch of road for the past 10 minutes, and anyway, there was nothing else around here but trees and telephone poles. He returned to Shirley's and pulled into the lot. The car rocked along the gravel like a small ship on turbulent waters. The woman was still out here on her phone, tucked between a white SUV and a red pickup truck with its tailgate down. He got a better look at her as he drove over to the far end of the lot. She was older than he'd originally thought when he'd glimpsed her from the road, maybe in her 50s, but that didn't matter. He could hear her voice even with the windows up and the AC running. Whoever was on the other end of her cell phone was taking a beating. He parked in a space farthest from the tavern door, where the gravel lot gave way to a tangle of dark, jungle-like trees. He rolled down his window and could hear country music playing inside the tavern. He could hear the woman's shrill voice, too. Someone named Eddie was being read the riot act, all right. Normally, he would wear a face for this. He considered it. The leather briefcase was right there in the trunk of the car, but in the end, he found he was too wound up to take the time to painstakingly select the appropriate face, apply the glue, wait the 45 seconds for it to adhere. Besides, this wasn't part of his formal process. This was just an impromptu detour to expel some pent-up excitement, so there'd be no face tonight. He got out of his car and headed across the parking lot, hands in his pockets. "Fuck you, Eddie, you're an asshole. You're an asshole," the woman said into her phone. She was wearing heels and kept wobbling along the gravel as she paced back and forth. She sounded drunk and looked it, too. There was a drain pipe running down the side of the building, a thin tributary of water trickling from its opening near the ground. The water pattered on a flat hunk of gray slate about the size of a dinner plate that was half sunk into the earth. Stull dug it out of the wet soil, and then he went over to the woman. "I love you, Eddie. You know I love you," the woman whined into her phone. Stull smashed the hunk of slate against the side of the woman's face. It was a good, solid, reliable strike. And she went down face first into the gravel without incident. Her cell phone skittered away, and Stull could hear Eddie on the other end of the line, still talking, oblivious, but Stull didn't care. He bent down, rolled the woman over, and marveled at the majesty of all that blood in her hair and running in delicate streaks along the side of her face. Her mouth was partially open, and there was gravel in her teeth. He removed a single tube sock from the back pocket of his slacks, balled it up, and stuffed it in the unconscious woman's mouth. Better safe than sorry on that score. Then he bent down, grabbed hold of her ankles, and dragged her toward the line of trees at the far end of the parking lot. Wayne Lee Stull was by no means a tall man, and to be honest, the majority of his bulk was in his belly, but he operated like some compact little machine built just for this very task. He wasn't even winded by the time he dragged her into the trees. Maybe it was dragging the back of her head, or her wounded head over the gravel, or maybe he just hadn't struck her hard enough. Whatever the case, she regained some semblance of consciousness as he pulled her the final few yards into those trees. Her eyelids fluttered. A soft moan vibrated against the tube sock stuffed in her mouth, but that was about it. Her halter top had ridden up as he dragged her, exposing one flat, ugly tit with a nipple like an acorn. He released her ankles, her heels wedging in the loose soil as her feet came down. Stull looked around, suddenly realizing he'd left the bloody wedge of slate in the parking lot. He smiled, what passed for a smile on his broken face anyway, then jogged back out into the lot. He retrieved the slate and carried it back into the woods. The woman was still on the ground, but she was moaning louder around the sock now and rocking back and forth on her back. She was apparently too dazed to realize she could have pulled the sock out herself, and that made Stull smile to himself once more. Bibby was suddenly there, breathing down the back of Stull's neck. Sometimes Bibby showed up at the end to watch. Other times Bibby just stayed gone. It used to bug Stull whenever Bibby showed up near the end. He was always here for the fun, never around for all the prep work, but he'd stopped caring a long time ago. It was what it was. Stull knelt down in the dirt beside the woman, where he gave that bulbous acorn a righteous twist. The woman bucked her hips and shook her head. Stull heard a scream building up behind that tube sock. Another 2 seconds like this, and she'd start struggling to her feet and clawing at the air with her fingernails, Stull knew. He slammed the hunk of slate down on the woman's face. He felt the ethmoid bone surrender and the front of her face collapse. He lifted the slate to examine his handiwork and was pleased to find that his practice had paid off. She was still alive, but there'd be no sound coming from her now. Her flailing had stopped too. He peeled the tube sock from her mouth. It was soaked with blood and gritty with gravel, and he tossed it aside. The woman moaned. Stull thought he felt Bibby's erection pressing into the small of his back. He spread the woman's lips apart, seeing the blood on her busted teeth, the pathetic squirm of her tongue beyond. Her upper palate had cracked down the middle by the force of his blow, her 2 front teeth separated by a good inch now, 1.5 inches or more, with a raw, bloody chasm running between them. The chunk of slate, while big as a plate, was shaped suspiciously like the great state of Texas, all corners and sharp geometric edges. Stull proceeded to knock the woman's teeth out one by one with those pointed edges, all the while wondering what Texas must be like. He'd never been, and he thought it might be fun to own a cowboy hat and to call everybody partner. The woman was still alive when he brought it down the slate one final time, splitting her head open down the middle. The spark of her entered Wayne Lee Stull, as dim and fleeting as a firefly. He sat in the dirt with his back against a tree, soaking it all up. He was out of breath. This, he supposed, was a young man's game, and Wayne Lee Stull hadn't been a young man in some time now. Bibby, that cowardly little bitch, had vamoosed again, always here for the party, never to help clean up. Before leaving the woods, Stull gathered up the bloody sock and the hunk of slate, took them back to his car, and stashed them in the plastic bag in his trunk. He kept a whole roll of plastic bags in the Kia's trunk. Then he cleaned his hands with sanitizer, changed his shirt. He couldn't abide wearing a messy shirt, and there was shit all over this one now, thanks very much. And then he got back in his car. The parking lot was deserted, so he drove slowly around before leaving, his window down and the AC off, listening. Nothing at first, but then he heard it, a cell phone ringing from somewhere under a car. No doubt Eddie the asshole, ringing back his best gal. Good, solid, reliable Eddie the asshole. Feeling pretty good about himself, Wayne Lee Stull exited the parking lot, hit the road, and continued southeast toward Kentucky.
His 2 fathers, one black, one white, both ex-cons whose sons were married and are murdered. And so these 2 men of violence decide to investigate the crime when it seems like the police have let the case go cold. And so Ike Randolph is an African-American man who owns his own landscaping business, who hasn't been in trouble since he got out of prison 15 years ago. And Buddy Lee Jenkins is a white man from southeastern Virginia who's a functioning or somewhat functioning alcoholic. And these 2 men who think they have very little in common except for their grief, they strike out on a path of really bloody revenge through southeastern Virginia. And it's funny, I always have to assure people that I'm not an actual revenge-minded person when I do live readings. So, you know, when you're 6 feet tall and 270, people kind of assume that. So what I'm going to read, I actually had somebody ask me that, like, how much Ike is you? And I'm like, none of it, I made it up. It's like, you know, Stephen King ain't a murderous clown that we know. But anyway, I'm going to read a section here, and it's just a little context. At this point in the book, Ike and Buddy Lee have begun their investigation, and they've run afoul of some henchmen for a motorcycle gang, and they have kidnapped one of the henchmen and taken him back to Ike's garage or his warehouse. And so they're gonna ask him a few questions. Andy's eyelids fluttered. He had promised to make them bleed for the breed. The tables, however, had been turned. He was bleeding, and it didn't seem like he was going to be allowed to stop anytime soon. He tried to raise his head, but it felt like it was full of bricks. Buddy Lee slapped the kid as hard as he could. He followed that up with a 1-2 combination to the ribs. He took a step back, leaned forward with both his hands on his knees. A glob of sputum worked its way out of his lungs. He closed his mouth and walked over to the trash can near the second roll-up door in Ike's warehouse. He spit into the small brown wastebasket. He didn't have to look at it to know it had more than its fair share of faint red spots mixed in it. "You all right?" Ike asked. "Yeah, just out of fucking shape. Why don't you ask him some questions?" Buddy Lee said. He walked over to a pallet of malt and sat down on top of it. Ike went to his cubicle office and got out his roller chair. He placed it right in front of the kid. Then he went to the tool rack. When he came back, he was carrying a tamper. It was a tool they used to even out the dirt when they planted a large tree or ran some sprinkler lines. A 4-foot-long wooden handle with a flat black iron square at one end. It was a fairly simple piece of equipment. He placed the tamper between him and the kid before taking a seat in the roller chair. The kid was in his wooden office chair. Ike had zip-tied his wrists to the arms of the chair. Once Buddy Lee had cleaned himself up, they had grabbed an area rug from Isaiah's office and rolled the kid up inside of it. The decision to take the kid wasn't something they had discussed. There was no need. It was obvious the kid and the big guy were somehow involved in what had happened to the boys. The kid was about 100 pounds lighter than his partner, and in this case, his partner had drawn the short straw, genetically speaking. So they left the big guy sprawled across the hallway floor and carried the skinny kid out of the townhouse like a pair of late night movers. They passed a few people as they walked to the truck, but most of them didn't look up from their cell phones long enough to notice two men carrying a vaguely human-shaped rug down the sidewalk. If any of Isaiah and Derek's neighbors had heard the ruckus, they didn't find it necessary to get involved. Apparently the neighborhood wasn't completely gentrified yet. Ike put his finger under the kid's chin. He raised his head until they were eye to eye. "What's your name?" "You ain't got no license on you." "That was smart," Ike said. Buddy Lee was shocked at how gentle his voice sounded. It was like he was about to tell the boy a bedtime story. "Fuck you," Andy mumbled. Ike pulled his finger away. The boy's head dropped into his chest. Blood dripped from his mouth and his nose. The wound on his cheek was weeping like a broken-hearted bride. Ike placed his hands on the end of the tamper's handle, then placed his chin on top of his hands. "You're smart, and you got heart, I'll give you that. But you got to know this ain't gonna end good for you, right? I mean, you break into the house that belonged to our sons. You try to kill my man over there. You know what that tells me? Either you killed our sons, or you know who did," Ike said. Andy didn't strain against the zip ties. He used every ounce of his waning strength to raise his head. "Who sent you to that house?" Ike asked. Andy spit in Ike's face. Then he let his head drop back down to his chest. The spittle landed on Ike's chin. Ike wiped it away and then stood. "Help me take off his boots," Ike said. Buddy Lee grabbed the kid's left foot and Ike grabbed the right. They pulled off his boots and tossed them next to the pellet line. Ike grabbed the tamper. He moved behind Andy. He raised it until the flat square was parallel with his belt buckle, and then he brought it down with all his strength. The metal head striking the concrete floor created a cacophony inside the cavernous warehouse. Ike took a position near Andy's left arm. He slammed the tamper down again. Both Andy and Buddy Lee flinched. Ike moved around Andy like the hands of a clock, each time slamming the tamper down and sending a harsh report through the building. "Who sent you?" Ike said finally. Andy flexed his wrist. The zip tie on his left hand was immovable. The one on his right, however, had the tiniest bit of play. The black guy had looped it through a spindle, then around his arm, then around his wrist, but the spindle was loose. If he put his back into it, he could probably break it. Then he could use the chair as a weapon and make a run for it. But none of that would happen if this motherfucker smashed his toes. "A guy sent us. He was looking for info on a girl," Andy said. Ike stopped moving. "What guy?" Buddy Lee asked. "I don't know. I don't know his name. He just told us he was looking for a girl that was supposed to be talking to a reporter. He wanted info on where she was," Andy said. He took a deep breath, sending an ache through his chest that made him wince. Ike bent forward. His face was barely an inch from Andy's. "You're lying to me," Ike said. "No, I swear." "What was the girl's name?" Ike asked. Andy sighed. He said her name was Tangerine. Buddy Lee pulled out a piece of paper. He stared at the drawing, then at the kid in the chair. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. Ike straightened. He went over to where Buddy Lee was leaning against a pallet of mulch. He left the tamper near Andy. "What is it?" Buddy Lee showed him the piece of paper. "I took this off the refrigerator at the boys' place. I thought it was an orange, but I suppose it could be a tangerine. But I don't know what the building is," Buddy Lee said. Ike thought of the napkins he had found at the house. "You think that drawing could be a bar? Maybe Isaiah was going to meet the Tangerine girl at the place they hung out at," Ike said. Buddy Lee pushed off the pallet and turned his back to the kid. He dropped his voice to the bottom of his chest. "What if she was supposed to meet them there and then they got killed? Whoever killed them might be the ones who hired Junior over there," Buddy Lee said. "He might be the one the kid at the bakery was talking about," Ike whispered. "That's what I was thinking," Buddy Lee said. "We should lean on him some more. I bet if I smash one of his toes, he'll remember who hired him," Ike said. Andy watched them as they turned their backs on him and huddled close. "What if he don't give it up?" Buddy Lee asked. Ike sighed. "They always give it up." Andy raised his head. It was now or never. He strained against the right zip tie. He relaxed and strained again, this time twisting his upper body and pulling his right arm to his left. Ike heard a snap a millisecond before he turned and took a chair to the head. The kid was swinging it like a club. His left wrist was still attached to the armrest. His bare feet hadn't made a sound on the cool concrete floor. Ike took the full brunt of his swing to the left side of his head. He went down on all fours like he was searching for grains of gold. Andy shoved the chair at the thin white guy. The guy instinctively grabbed the chair legs and Andy pushed him backward toward the pallet of mulch. Buddy Lee felt his feet slip on the concrete even as he gripped the chair by his legs. His chest rattled, his lungs begged for air. Was he passing out? He wasn't sure, but the next thing he knew, his ass was on the floor and his hands seemed to go numb. A coughing fit picked the absolute worst time to possess him. The kid pulled the chair out of Buddy Lee's hand and raised it above his head. The shadow of the chair cast over him was the shadow of death. Buddy Lee felt a desperate surge of adrenaline course through his veins, and a huge wad of phlegm escaped his chest at last. Sweet oxygen filled his lungs like ambrosia. Buddy Lee grabbed his jackknife from his back pocket. As the kid swung the chair downward, Buddy Lee rose to one knee. In one smooth motion, he flicked the blade out with his thumb and shoved the knife into the kid's belly up to the hilt. The hole in his belly took some of the power out of the kid's swing. Buddy Lee raised his free arm and blocked the blow rather easily. He watched as the kid stumbled backwards. He pulled himself off of Buddy Lee's blade, and a languid stream of crimson began to pour from the hole in his gut. Ike shook his head side to side like a hound dog killing a rat. He jumped to his feet and grabbed the tamper. As the kid stumbled back from Buddy Lee, Ike gripped the handle with a two-handed, high-choke grip. He swung the tamper like he was sending a pitch into the upper deck. The flat-tempered iron connected with the back of the kid's head with a dull, fleshy thump. The kid crumpled to the floor with the chair landing on his chest. Ike stood over him. The kid's thin lips were quivering like the death throes of some strange woodland creature. The kid had hit him with the chair. He tried to kill Buddy Lee. He'd broken into Isaiah's house. He spit in Ike's face. He'd probably been lying about some guy hiring. He probably knew who killed Isaiah. The kid's eyes rolled back in his head. Hell, Ike thought, he might even be the one that wrecked the headstone. You motherfucker, Ike screamed. He raised the tamper and slammed it onto the kid's head. The skin around the eye socket split and bones beneath it shifted. The kid looked like he was having a stroke. Ike raised the tamper again and brought it down with all his strength. His biceps and deltoids worked together with long practiced synchronicity. He'd done this same motion thousands of times, hundreds of thousands of times. His wide forearms burned as he ran the tamper in the kid's face again and again and again. He felt something wet splash against his face. Bits of bone and teeth flew up from the floor. You killed him, didn't you? Ike howled. Buddy Lee stood and leaned against the pallet. His lung was on fire. The tamper moved up and down relentlessly.
Things with like point of view, like even just calling a breast a tit is such a like Anglo-Saxon detachment, like bit of simple horror. Like how much do you fuss with that kind of thing between drafts? Like do you change up the voice, or does it just sort of come as the idea and like you roll with it? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
For both of you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, specifically, that character that in that scene that I read is probably the least nice person in the book, arguably. And but yeah, I mean, when you write any scene and you're putting your head in the head of the character, the tendency is to then describe the way that character would see the world. And somebody like him, who happens to be just an angry, slightly detached sociopath who is also meticulous and fastidious about the world around him and how he operates, that's how he's going to reference stuff. So he's clearly also a misogynistic asshole. So he would refer to an exposed breast as an ugly flat tit, because that's how his mind works. And he feels he's, so it's, I think that's, anybody can, get a scene and write a scene from front to back. It's then when you put the dressing on it, the icing, or all the little filigrees that make it what it is and who the character is. Those are the nuances that you're picking up on that flesh out those characters and make those scenes real. If I did that, if I had a different character in that book do that same thing, he would be thinking of it differently. So I would write it differently.
Yeah, I think syntax is important when you're talking about it. It helps differentiate characters, their viewpoints, whether you're doing third person or first person. Language, vocabulary, sentence structure, everything is germane or important to the character development. I have characters like with Razorblade Tears. Ike is very taciturn, doesn't like to talk a lot. He's not a big conversationalist. And if you read the book, Buddy Lee is too verbose. And so both of them use that as a way to sort of also differentiate themselves from the pain that they're feeling. Ike doesn't want to talk about it, and so he holds it in, so his conversation is short. Whereas Buddy Lee doesn't want to deal with it, and so he overtalks, he exaggerates, he uses a lot of humor, southern down-home humor. But both of them are broken, and so using the dialogue, using the verbiage, help show that brokenness. With the thing I'm working on now with Titus, you get to know Titus in the book. He's a very, very ordered, structured, almost obsessive compulsive person, and so he uses language for the express immediate reason of communicating. He's not a very flowery person. Even he has a girlfriend in the book, and even his girlfriend talks about how he can be very cold. He's very logical about things. You get to know him, you find out that he's like that because his mother died when he was young, and he feels like he doesn't have control over anything. And so he seeks control in everything he does. I mean, he's a guy that color coordinates his clothes by alphabetical order. So and so yeah, verbiage, vocabulary, dialogue is all part of differentiating those characters. Like Ronald said, if everybody talked the same, if every character talked the same in the book would be boring. And so you've got to do that. And I think it's something that it comes naturally, but doesn't come easily. And I think there's a difference there. But if you're telling a story, of course you want different voices, and dialogue is a big part of that. But also the way characters infer the world, their internal monologue also is very important too. So.
Yeah, and I think your characters, Ike and Buddy Lee, and that are a pretty good example of that too, because they are very different characters. That it's not just even in the dialogue, but if you're telling the scene from one of their point of view, and they are to walk into a bar, Ike will his narration of what he's seeing when he walks in will be very different than what Buddy Lee
Exactly.
sees. Ike will take probably, not to step on your character,
No.
but he would take in more elements and be a little more wary and cautious and look around, whereas Buddy Lee was, like you said, he's a little more impromptu in his observations and how he reacts to stuff.
It's so funny you said it because there is a scene later on in the book where they go to a gay bar, and Ike is very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Whereas Buddy Lee is like, "Do they have liquor?" I don't give a damn what's going on. They got liquor. That's fine. So, and so that's the way they infer and the way they and see the world. But that's not just true for them. It's any character, and some of the books that I admire do that extraordinarily well. I mentioned Stephen King. Clive Barker does that a lot. He uses almost different purple prose for different characters to denote the way they're seeing the world. Even when he's talking about characters that are, for lack of a better word, gods and wizards. If you read a Magica, the way that John Furry Zacharias talks is totally different, but just as valid as the way Pio Pie talks. And so, stuff like that. That's how you carry those characters through. So, but that's a great question. Thank you.